Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's March lecture from the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society. My name is Scott Bradley. I am the Executive Director of your Thunder Bay Museum. Tonight, we'll be having a lecture from Nick Duplessis titled Social Democratic Politics and the Evolution of the CCF in Thunder Bay from 1945 to 1959. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight in person who braved the snow and those joining us by Zoom or by phone. If you are joining us tonight online, just a reminder that microphones and your video have been disabled and we will not be able to see or hear you. But please do use the Q&A function or the chat function should you have questions for our speaker, and we will try to get to those at the end of tonight's presentation. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Nick Duplessis, graduated from Lakehead University in 2020 with a Master's of Arts in History. His research followed Thunder Bay's post-war labor movement. Nicholas currently volunteers on the City of Thunder Bay's Heritage Advisory Committee, the Thunder Bay's Literacy Group's Board of Directors, and is president of the Canadian International Council, Thunder Bay branch. Nicholas is from Northwestern Ontario and spends his free time playing hockey, coaching minor hockey, and spending time outdoors. Mr. Duplessis.
Thank you, Scott. I hope everybody can hear me all right. So one volunteering commitment that wasn't included in that introduction was my work I do with the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society on the board of directors. Part of my role is that I chair the publications committee as well as the plaques and programs committee. We had originally had another speaker lined up for this event, but something unfortunate occurred and we were looking for a replacement. And I'd like to thank the plaques and programs committee, specifically Donna Gilhooly, Greg Johnson, and Steve Jobbett for entrusting me to take over this lecture and deliver something of substance and of quality. So I appreciate that. I'd also like to take the moment for those who attended our AGM, which ran just before this from 7 to 8, to welcome our new board members and our returning board members, and also well wishes to those board members who are leaving us. So I will be talking today about social democratic politics at the Lakehead from 1943 to 1963. This is a lecture that is based on my master's thesis. It's actually about a half of my master's thesis that, as Scott said, I completed in April of 2022. The other half focuses on the labor movement and the same time period. I won't be speaking about that too much just for time's sake. It is quite a blizzard out and I need to get home at some point because as everyone knows, historians can go on for 2, 3, 4 hours about their work if they really wanted to. So I'll try to weave in some elements of the labor movement, but I'll be speaking specifically about politics. Could you go to the next slide, please, Marcus? So just some early socialist history at the Lakehead. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the study of left-wing politics and of socialism in Thunder Bay and the region is something that's well versed and well discussed in the historiography. And I know that a lot of individuals who are on this call or who will be watching are well versed in the literature. So I apologize if I skip over or skim something that you might find important, but I'm going to try to do my best to provide a brief introduction. So we'll start in 1904 with Louis L. Peltier, a future mayor of Fort William, who ran in the 1904 federal election as a member of the Independent Labour Party. He was unsuccessful. The Ontario Socialist Party also ran a candidate in that 1904 federal election, and they too were unsuccessful. The Ontario Socialist Party, like most socialist parties in Thunder Bay, were largely powered and supported by ethnic immigrants, including the Finnish and Ukrainian working class individuals, as well as other ethnicities that were arriving in Thunder Bay around the turn of the century. The ILP failed in 1904, and they sort of went into a brief period of obscurity, but they were revitalized in 1911, under the guidance of Frederick Robinson, an English architect. He played a key role in the Lakehead labor movement by helping to found the Port Arthur Trades and Labor Council, revitalizing that party, the ILP, contesting several elections, offering vocational training to the working class, and he also served as the editor of the newspaper, The Wage Earner. In that same year, 1911, the SPC collapsed. Former Port Arthur SPC members convened at the Lakehead with representatives from across Canada to discuss the possibility of a pan-Canadian Socialist Party. The outcome, the Socialist Democratic Party of Canada, or SDPC, sought to, quote, educate the workers of Canada to consciousness of their class position in society, their economic servitude to the owners of capital, and to organize them into a political party to seize the reins of government and transform all capitalist property into the collective property of the working class. So that's what the SDPC sought to achieve. That's also what I talk a lot about on Friday nights. Thank you for the laugh. The SDPC were among the few parties or organizations at that time period calling for class unity. And they played an important role in the early decades of socialist organization at the Lakehead, although they did fall out of existence after the First World War because of a ban imposed on the party by the Canadian government. Though it was short-lived, its legacy lived on through several local organizations, and many early CCF members, Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, had their roots in socialism in this party. Moving through World War I into the late decade of the 10s and into the 1920s, socialist candidates began finding increasing success in contesting local elections. Some examples include farmer Labour candidate Harry Mills, who won the Fort William riding in the 1919 Ontario general election, A.M. Dennis, an ILP member who won the Fort William mayor's race two consecutive times. Several ILP members and union members also won seats on city councils. Throughout the 1920s, socialism at the Lakehead was divided into different spheres of influence and competing interests. The One Big Union was prominent from 1919 to 1922, after which the Communist Party of Canada and the International Workers of the World, whose presence in the Lakehead dates to before the First World War, competed and struggled for primacy in the region among the region's socialists. 1935 marked a decline in labor radicalism, but it also witnessed the introduction of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, hereafter the CCF, to the Lakehead. With the exception of a few committed communists, the CCF would succeed in becoming a pan-class party at the Lakehead, regardless of industry or ethnicity. The dramatic shift in Lakehead socialism that occurred in 1935 had its genesis in 1932 after the emergence of the CCF. That year, 1932, 131 delegates at a convention in Calgary, representing farmers, laborers, and socialists, chose to unite under one banner. The overarching goal to combat the unfair conditions created for the working class by business and capital, which was punctuated by the effects of the Great Depression. A year later, at its first national convention in Regina, the Regina Manifesto was created and released, which became a cornerstone of Canadian socialist thought, promising that, quote, no CCF government will rest content until it has eradicated capitalism and put into operation the full program of socialized planning, which will lead to the establishment in Canada of the Cooperative Commonwealth. Next slide, please. So how did the CCF actually become prominent at the Lakehead and arrive? The CCF as a social movement in Ontario more generally was spearheaded by Agnes MacPhail, the only woman in the House of Commons at the time, and William Bill Irvine, a Labour member of Parliament, both who were appointed organizers of the Ontario CCF in 1932, shortly after the Calgary conference. The first CCF club in Toronto was established on the 22nd of December in 1932, and throughout 1933, the Ontario CCF would continue to create formal affiliations with both Labour and Socialist groups throughout Ontario. Before the 1934 Ontario Provincial Election, there's no record of CCF clubs existing in the Lakehead or the surrounding region. But afterwards, the first record of a CCF club in a town in northwestern Ontario actually belongs to Scriber, Ontario, which is about 2 hours east of Thunder Bay. Scriber, Ontario is a railroad town, with a small population, but at that time in 1934, they had a small and vibrant CCF branch, reported to have over 100 members from Scriber and the surrounding area. The president, the Scribers Club's first president, Jack F. McKevitt, was a member of the Provincial Council of the Ontario CCF, and the Scriber CCF had pledged to run a candidate in the 1934 election. So providing and then subsequently removing support for the farmer worker nominee, Jay Gilbanks, After they had removed support for Gilbanks, the Scriber CCF recognized that they needed a strong candidate for the 1934 provincial election, the first one that they would be running as a CCF branch in the region. So Jack McKevitt traveled to Port Arthur on May 26, 1934, and gave an address outlining the CCF platform to any potentially interested party members. Described by the local media coverage as enthusiastic, the meeting witnessed the formal opening of the first CCF branch in Port Arthur, the election of TJ Thompson and Sam Wright to the positions of president and vice president, and the signing up of more than 50 members in the first day. Sam Wright, the vice president and a Port Arthur alderman, would be the Lakehead's first CCF candidate running in the 1934 provincial election. The Fort William CCF branch would follow shortly after the establishment of the Port Arthur. Sam Wright received 4% of the vote share in 1934 and faced dismal results, but the 1935 federal election marked the first inroads the CCF made in politics, both in Ontario, but particularly Lakehead. Alexander Gibson, a longtime union man, ran in Port Arthur, while Garfield Anderson, who we'll be talking about more later, ran in Fort William. Gibson was involved in the Lakehead labor movement since 1920, playing a founding role in the Port Arthur Trades and Labor Council with Frederick Erie, and ran numerous political campaigns that by 1935 he was already a political veteran. Anderson had little involvement in the labor leadership during his early life, but had moved to Fort William in 1923 as a barber and had begun to increasingly take an interest in politics. In that election, Gibson received 10.8% of the popular vote, more than doubling the share from 1934, and Anderson received 11.8%. These percentages, while not particularly high, did mark a dramatic shift where Wright won less than 4% of the vote and the CCF did not field a candidate in Fort William. Clearly, by 1935, the CCF's momentum was surging at the Lakehead over the span of these two elections. Next slide, please. So the 1943 provincial election, in 1935, in 1934, after the previous provincial election, J.S. Woodsworth, the leader of the Ontario CCF, had to restructure the provincial CCF, and they did not make significant inroads into Ontario politics until 1943. In that year, both provincial candidates running for the CCF in the ridings of Port Arthur and Fort William succeeded in winning their spot as members of Legislative Assembly. The first being Frederick Robinson, and the second being Garfield Anderson, who I had previously mentioned. Next slide, please. So Frederick Robinson was born on August 2nd, 1903. He was the first mayor, and I know we're talking about provincial politics, but he also was mayor of Port Arthur. He was the first mayor of Port Arthur to actually be born in the city. He was a member of Legislative Assembly representing the CCF in the riding of Port Arthur from 1943 to 1951. He had 2 stints as Port Arthur mayor as well. He was a machinist and a member of a trade union, and he was really well read on socialist literature, including the work of Marx and Lenin. In a 1986 interview, after he had passed with his wife, Jean, she was quoted as saying, "Fred was a socialist, a real socialist. He was for centralized planning and for doing something of means." Next slide, please. The Fort William candidate, Garfield Anderson, who also served as Fort William mayor, while Robinson served as Port Arthur mayor, was born May 7th, 1887 in Allenford, Ontario. He moved to Westfort and permanently settled there after the First World War to open a barbershop. He was a CCF member of Legislative Assembly for 5 years and also served as mayor of Fort William for the same 5 years, 1943 to 1948. So those 2 individuals are important because they're the first CCFers from the Lakehead to find tangible political success. Obviously, the Lakehead had an appetite for social democratic politics at this time, electing 2 CCF members in the same election and keeping them in office until 1948. So this is sort of the start of the point in 1943 where I actually start some of the analysis and start looking at what the CCF looks like and what it means to the individuals. So we'll get into that more as we move on. Next slide, please. So the local context in 1943, there was liberal political dominance at the Lakehead at that time. C.D. Howe, very popular minister of everything, someone who is seen in every Canadian textbook, had been the member of parliament for Port Arthur, a role he would continue until 1957. Charles Cox, somewhat of a legend in Port Arthur and Thunder Bay today, someone who's very well known. He was the longtime MLA for Port Arthur at this time. And Dan McIver, who only won in 1935, would serve as the Fort William MP for a significant amount of time. So any inroads that the CCF made into Lakehead politics during 1943 or the 1940s would be against the backdrop of a strong liberal presence. The national context for the 1943 election win is the ongoing Second World War, and in particular, what domestic society would look like once the war had finished. The CCF's main voting bloc, working class individuals, were extremely anxious and paranoid about what a post-Second World War Canada would look like. In particular, at that time, they were unsure if the ending of the war would mean the return to the conditions in the Great Depression. And as many can understand, most individuals were justified in the belief of not wanting to go back to those conditions because of how hard they were for individuals, especially those from working class families and working class individuals faced at the Lakehead. So this election, the key election issue, there was two. The first was what were the candidates' post-war vision and what would the role the Lakehead play in the province? The election essentially came down to which party can provide or sort of posit the best post-war vision. What would be the vision for Canada after the Second World War? Because by the time of the election, the war had been far from over, but individuals and politicians had sort of sensed that the tides were turning and we were starting to get towards the end of the war. The CCF's Port Arthur candidate, Robinson, had a working class background and connections to unions that he was comfortable utilizing to court voters, while Anderson in Fort William operated as though he had a stethoscope to the heartbeat of Canadian industrial relations. Both candidates and the CCF in general capitalized on becoming Labour's political arm at a time when Mackenzie King, then Prime Minister, had his Labour policies at their lowest point, and the Canadian federal government began to look into reforms that would later become the post-war compromise. Robinson's main opponent in 1943 was incumbent Liberal Charlie Cox. They became bitter political rivals. They would run in elections against each other 4 times over the next 9 years. The Herald Doc Oakes, an individual who fought in World War I and also lives on in the Aviation Hall of Fame throughout Canada, ran under the Conservative banner. Garfield Anderson in Fort William ran against Liberal Campbell Hanna and Conservative Roy Kirkup. Despite a sour relationship, Charlie Cox campaigned significantly with C.D. Howe as a way to garner support. Cox's campaign laid largely on 2 foundations: promoting his experience and record as both an MLA and as Port Arthur's mayor, and attacking the CCF as a political stepping stone to communism, something that we still see as a political tactic today. Some examples of newspaper advertisements or campaign strategies that I came across in my research was Tim Buck, who was the leader of the Communist Party at the time, playing Frederick Robinson and Garfield Anderson as a marionette, indicating that communism was using social democratic politicians as a stepping stone, as I said, and as a facade. Another one was that accusing CCF candidates of wanting to get rid of and kill Winston Churchill, obviously something that would be powerful at the time, considering the role that Winston Churchill was actively playing in the Second World War. Both generally fear-mongering, but something that could be powerful, especially during a time of heightened nationalism. The CCF were very well aware that a significant amount of their support derived from Canadians unhappy with the country's liberal order and experience over the last decade, And the CCF in Port Arthur specifically were willing to build on these anxieties to thrust their campaigns forward. Several times throughout the election cycle, the CCF ran advertisements that suggested they were the only party who could avoid a return to the pre-depression conditions. Their post-war vision was for Canada with an increased safety net, with a welfare state that helped to eliminate the possibility of returning to breadlines and to widespread poverty and to widespread unemployment, a tactic that was effective in helping the CCF not win that election, but become the official minority party opposition for the first time, winning 34 seats. As something neat that I came across in my research as I was looking through this, as a side note, is that there's still a lot of radio speeches from Frederick Robinson that still exists at the Lakehead University Archives. It's a great resource into looking back at the way that politicians spoke then and sort of framed their messaging. It's vastly different than what you see on Twitter today. It's a really interesting case study. So to summarize the 1943 election, it was really about which party could best convince the public their post-war vision was the strongest. Both Garfield, Anderson, and Robinson won their elections convincingly, and the defeat of Cox was particularly a shock. The Ontario CCF became the official opposition, winning 34 seats. The Conservatives were the minority government at 38 seats, so they were only 4 seats off the lead. Next slide, please. So 1943 was sort of a watershed moment for democratic socialism at the Lakehead with the election of Anderson and Robinson. Over the next 3 elections, you can see that the CCF will start to sort of lose steam, run out of favor. Eventually, both Anderson and Robinson will be replaced with different politicians, and CCF sort of goes into a dormant phase at the Lakehead for 6 years before 1957. In 1945, 2 years after the initial win, the federal and provincial election were held 7 days apart, June 4th and June 11th, 1945, respectively. The CCF did better in the federal election, but still quite poorly, and they were absolutely decimated in the provincial election. Gerald Kaplan, a historian of socialism in Canada, wrote that these days, June 4th and June 11th, 1945, proved to be black days in CCF's annals. Socialism was effectively removed from the Canadian political agenda. And while that may have some truth to it, that wasn't true for the Lakehead, because in 1945, Robinson and Anderson managed to win. The Ontario CCF went from 34 to 8 seats, meaning that Robinson and Anderson's victory now meant that the Lakehead accounted for 25% of Ontario's CCF MLAs. Because of this, they were both able to take much larger roles in the party, with Anderson becoming the deputy House leader and Robinson becoming the caucus secretary. The transition to the new era in CCF politics, the lull and then the election of Douglas Fisher, began in 1948 when Anderson lost his seat in Fort William to Charlie Cox, who seems to be running in every election in different capacities. He's a mayor, he's in Fort William, he's in Port Arthur. I'm sure if West Fort had a riding, he'd be running there as well. So he lost to Charlie Cox in Fort William, but Robinson found success. It appears that the difference between Robinson's success and Anderson's lack of can be reduced to each politician's relationship to Northwestern Ontario's forests. The historical record overwhelmingly showed that the state of the forests in Lakehead and the surrounding area was the dominant issue of the 1948 provincial election. After the Second World War, the Kennedy Commission, which released its findings in 1947, was designed and operated to diagnose the health of the forests and provide long-term planning for forests in Ontario. At the same time, leading up to the elections, there was devastating forest fires across the region, many of which were unprecedented at the time for their damage, including one just outside of Nipigon, heading towards Thunder Bay, or what became Thunder Bay. There was also government warnings about the use and misuse of the forests at the time, all of which culminated in a general anxiety about the status of forests in the Lakehead at the time. That's particularly important when you consider the labor market in 1948. This was a period of transition for the Lakehead where we became less focused on, although we still are, we became slightly less focused on natural resources and began to develop a secondary and tertiary economy. That said, a lot of individuals still made their living at bush camps, in logging, in lumber, in the forests, as we still do today. So you could imagine the fear that you would have when all of these reports are coming from the government. There's forest fires everywhere. It sort of adds context as to why the forests were such an important issue at that time. Robinson was able to win, in my opinion, because of his experience working as a working man with and in forests. He actually testified on behalf of the CCF in the Kennedy Commission. One such advertisement during the 1948 election cycle from Robinson in the Port Arthur News Chronicle read, and I quote, "Recognizing the forests as the lifeblood of the Northwest, Fred Robinson read, prepared, and presented a brief to the Royal Commission on Forestry. This brief has been highly commended and has been adopted in convention as CCF forest policy. It is a clean-cut statement of forest policy designed to make this great asset serve the best interests of the real owners of the forest, the people." So I really like that quote. I think it's interesting because it shows in 1948 the importance of the forest to the election, but the language also shows and really reflects the social democratic position on forests, is that it's owned not by private companies, not by the government, but it's a collective resource that the people share. Something that I would like to comment on as well. As I said, this was an important issue, and a lot of ethnicities and those of different ethnic backgrounds were able to connect themselves to this issue, including the Finnish working class, who were quite involved as bushworkers, as well as other ethnic groups. An obvious connection that I made while doing my research is the role and importance of forest and forest management to the Indigenous people of the region. So obviously, this would have been an important election issue for them. But at that time, Indigenous individuals were still not allowed to vote, something that wouldn't be able to happen in a provincial election until 1954. So that's a little piece of context as well for the voting bloc. So to further cement Robinson's status as the regional voice for forestry, Ontario CCF leader Ted Joliffe remarked in a radio speech to the people of Lakehead in 1948. He made several remarks on commending Fred Robinson on his work he's done with forests, and saying that he would put him into a minister position overseeing forests and natural resources should the CCF win the 1948 election. So, as I said, forests were the dominant issue. Robinson won in 1948. Garfield Anderson lost. In 1951, the next election, Robinson would lose his seat. There'd be no CCF representation at the Lakehead. And this was for a lot of reasons. First was voter apathy. Members of the CCF party just seemed to lack the energy and the drive that a grassroots movement like the CCF needs to sustain itself. This is something that was very, very present in oral testimony from Fred Robinson's wife and daughter, as well as other oral histories that I was able to utilize and find. Another issue was I say issue as it's a bad thing, but there also was an increasing period of economic stability in the 1950s, which reduced the need for a revolutionary government or for a social democratic government. And lastly, the Red Scare. With the emergence of the Soviet Union in 1945 as a world superpower and the beginning of the Cold War, these lines of propaganda had always existed, but the conservative and liberal politicians and their sort of political machines were much more effective in linking social democrats and the CCF by extension to communism. But there was quite a fear of communism at that time, and the ability to more successfully link this party to communism was one of the key reasons why they lost a lot of votes during that period. Next slide, please. So in between 1951 and 1957, there were no CCF members elected to either federal or provincial roles, although some did still continue to serve on city councils. And as mayor for a couple of years, Fred Robinson did. Jean Robinson, Fred's wife, played a significant role in the party during this period. She noted in her oral testimony that there was continued party member apathy. That said, they still did have weekly activities during this period that kept the party strong, kept growing a base, and tried to re-energize members. And this includes Marxist-Leninist reading groups, study groups, book clubs, and continued political rallies. The Labour Progressive Party, founded by Bruce Magnussen, who I talk about a little bit in my actual thesis, but not in the presentation, they actually had a role in keeping the CCF suppressed. They were fairly committed communists, and the actual strongest attacks on the CCF weren't from the Liberals or the Conservatives, but from the communists themselves, because they argued that the CCF was as detrimental to their cause as any of the more established political organizations. In the secondary literature, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that the CCF at this time was more than okay to take a gadfly role. So an organization, a political party that didn't actually take power at any time, but continually put pressure on Liberal and Conservative governments to, gradually adopt their policies, which they did, but they weren't able to get in power. So 1957 is when the party re-energizes locally. I'll get to 1957 in a second, but next slide, please. I just wanted to touch on organized labor quickly. So the reason why organized labor is important is because in 1961, after a few years of exploration, the organized labor movement in Canada through the Canadian Labour Congress formally merged with the CCF to form the NDP, which is the current Social Democratic Party we have in Canada right now, the New Democratic Party. I've been talking specifically about the CCF and their evolution to the NDP, but I thought I would add a slide just to sort of provide a couple notes on the organized labor movement, because obviously the CCF is only half of the puzzle when we're talking about the genesis of the NDP. So the NDP, as I said, was formed as a merger between the CCF and the Canadian Labour Congress, in 1961. Organized labor played an increasingly important role in Canadian politics after the Second World War. The Second World War was characterized by a lot of strike action, a lot of direct action that forced Mackenzie King and his Liberal government to gradually adopt reforms that once compiled became the postwar compromise. The postwar compromise occurred through the passage of the Wartime Labor Relations Regulations on February 7th, 1944, the tenets of which were later enshrined in the 1948 Industrial Relations and Disputes Investigation Act. The post-war settlement is defined by the legally entrenched right of union recognition and bargaining by employers, but which only could occur through bureaucratized channels within the Canadian state apparatus. Workers successfully earned the right to recognition and bargaining in 1944, and they also received and succeeded in finding consistent financial support through the 1946 RAND decision. As a consequence, more accessible pathways were opened to unionization and increased financial security, and the density of unions rose dramatically in the post-war period, increasing from 359,000 to 831,000 union members between 1939 and 1946. So the course of the war, union membership in Canada more than doubled. Though organized labor made gains in the post-war period, there were negative elements intrinsic to the compromise that worked to harm the labor movement. Labor would have more leverage than ever before in the workplace, but it also dramatically altered the structure of Canadian unionism by reducing the influence of rank-and-file union members in favor of enlarged hierarchical union bureaucracies. Unions became less radical, the rank-and-file became less important, and it also made wildcat and sympathy strikes illegal. This is an important thread as we look at the origins of the NDP, because it does provide a little bit of context as to why the organized labor movement would like to merge with the CCF, more or less. And I'm oversimplifying here. It was harder for organized labor to take direct action, so they needed a formalized, accountable political arm to work with through the Canadian state to make these changes, because they weren't able to do any of the old style rank and file striking, sympathy strikes, wildcat strikes that they had done in the past. So in summary, the negative effects of the effects of the Lakehead labor movement of post-war labor policy is de-radicalization, bureaucratization, and another thread, internationalism and consolidation. in which many unions started becoming parts of different international unions or larger union umbrella bodies. So what does this mean for the CCF at the Lakehead, and why is it important? I won't talk about it much more, but the general thought that I have is that labor began to need politics and politics began to need labor because of the changes affecting both. And it's the beginning of the 1950s where we start to move towards the merger of the CCF and the CLC into the NDP. Next slide, please. So 1957, as I said, getting back on track, the CCF movement at the Lakehead was re-energized by this man, Douglas Fisher. He was born in Sioux Lookout in 1919 and passed away relatively recently in 2009. He was a high school teacher who taught history, shout out, and was a MP for Port Arthur from 1957 to 1965, the first 4 years of which he was with the CCF and later the NDP. He beat C.D. Howe, the Minister of Everything, in the 1957 election. He was known as a maverick in the sense that he didn't always follow party orthodoxy. He was very critical of his own party. He was very accountable. He sort of he fell in party line based on his beliefs, but he wasn't afraid to question or to side with other parties or to make his own mind up depending on the issue. He was very independent and he was very principled. He became a journalist after his political career, most notably with the Toronto Sun. And a smaller fact about him, which I think is neat just based on my background, is that he was also the head of Hockey Canada from 1974 to 1977. Next slide, please. So how did Douglas Fisher beat C.D. Howe? C.D. Howe was a nationally recognized individual with political experience, having served in Port Arthur as an MP for over 20 years. Fisher was a political novice. He might have known some people around Port Arthur, but he was relatively unknown. So how did Fisher beat Howe? Well, the first is personal charisma and presence. Personal charisma, likability, that's an important factor in being a politician, but so is presence. C.D. Howe had believed that he had the election locked up because he had never heard of Douglas Fisher. So he'd spent more time during the campaign period actually traveling Canada, helping other Liberal candidates who might have been in danger than running his own campaign in Port Arthur. Douglas Fisher was actually here. I'm going to tie this into the third point, which is union support. Douglas Fisher was not only here in Port Arthur, but he made an extensive effort to travel to regional communities in the riding, hosting meetings often in towns like Nipigon and Scriber. He also went out to bush camps and met with different union leaders, actually going to the camps themselves. Second, which I also think is really interesting, is the use of television. So television was a new political medium at this time. C.D. Howe had used no television during his 1957 election. He tried to at the end, but it was too late. And the use of this medium to sort of talk to the house, to talk to every house in Port Arthur, or every house with a television at that time anyway, was really, really powerful. He did it in a non-conventional way, or what we would think of now anyway. Now you would think you would see like a 30-second advertisement on TV, which would either be listing some of your policies or attacking another individual. Douglas Fisher actually rented half-hour segments once to 3 times a week, depending on the week. And he would sit with a chalkboard and a single piece of chalk, and he would go through his policy in detail. So he would talk everything from old age to forests to labor policy to education. And it was really fascinating because it was a great way to communicate to the public in a transparent, open, and honest way. And he was able to use his skills developed as a teacher to do so. And I always laugh because I'm trying to think of politicians today, if they had to sit in front of a TV for half an hour with nothing but a piece of chalkboard and go over their policy decisions. It would probably be number 1, scream at opponent. Number 2, write a 3,000-page bill. I don't know what it would look like, but politicians were built with a different ilk back then where they actually had to have substance, and Douglas Fisher was great at this. So his innovative use of television when C.D. Howe did not look at the medium or use the medium to its true potential is probably the biggest reason as to why Douglas Fisher was able to win. Next slide, please. So Fisher successfully won re-election twice, including in 1958 when the National CCF took a really, really dramatic hit. They weren't able to recover from it. And that 1958 election sort of signaled the change and the transition to the NDP, where it became apparent that the CCF wouldn't find mainstream political success, and that change was necessary. So after 1958, the CCF began exploring through joint committees with the CLC a gradual merger, an idea of which Fisher was often critical. Fisher's relationship with organized labor and the working class differed significantly from Robinson and Anderson's. Robinson, in particular, was a very well-versed socialist. Fisher, I would say, had socialistic tendencies, and if you had to classify him, he would also probably be a socialist, but I don't think he was of the same ilk as Robinson. He was, at best, lukewarm to the idea of merging with the organized labor movement. During his tenure, he can't be credited directly with these, but he was involved in a lot of national efforts in the region, including the shutdown of Cancar and its eventual reopening, the development of the Trans-Canada Pipeline, and the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Next slide, please. So the new party idea. That Fisher was opposed to a formal alliance between Canadian Labour and the CCF is no secret, according to the secondary literature. Historian Desmond Morton writes, Douglas Fisher, one of the few CCF newcomers to Parliament in the 57 and 58 elections, predicted that the alliance would deliver few votes and unions would sit on their financial resources. The problem for Fisher and other doubting CCFers was that there really was no alternative. That's how bad the results were. Gad Horowitz writes that Fisher was adamantly against the idea of a merger, and that he was the only federal CCF MP to publicly speak out against the idea of the new party. Fisher, in his own correspondence writing to a fellow named Carl Hamilton, remarked, I believe that if the new party idea is proceeded with further, it will lead to the wiping out of our representation in the next federal election. Fisher would later moderate his criticism, but he did continue to question the practical wisdom of being aligned with Labour, and he was very critical, if not the most critical CCFer on the idea of merging with the CLC and becoming the NDP. To provide one last glimpse of Fisher's antipathy to the trade union movement, consider this passage from Dan Azoulay, who is also a historian of social democratic policies in Canada. The new party was plagued too by some rather imprudent criticisms from its own ranks, criticisms that the media were only too eager to publicize. The loudest critic, Douglas Fisher, CCF MP from Port Arthur, first expressed his reservations publicly in October 1959 at the Ontario CCF Annual Convention. Fisher opposed the closer cooperation with the trade union movement that the new party project entailed. He argued that because Labour had always been politically apathetic, except at election time, it would not contribute much to the new party on a day-to-day basis, and that a closer association with unions would only give the party a bad image. When you look at the secondary literature and what individuals are garnering about Douglas Fisher, it becomes quite clear that he was, like I said, lukewarm to the idea, if not in favor of merging with the CLC to form the NDP. And there's also hints of his dislike for trade unionism and unionism in general. What these individuals writing about Fisher lacked access to was documents that actually ground him in the day-to-day realities of Port Arthur and are available at the local level. A different picture of him emerges when he is placed in the context of the everyday concerns of the Port Arthur riding, regardless of his opinion on the NDP and its emergence. By all available records, specifically 19 boxes of archival documents at the Douglas Fisher Funds at Lakehead University, Fisher had a congenial and actually positive relationship with local unions. Fisher was himself a union man and was part of a union despite being maligned as anti-Labour by prominent CCF and later NDP members. He did a lot of work on behalf of unions in Thunder Bay, or what became Thunder Bay, liaisoning with the federal government on behalf of several workers' concerns in Port Arthur and Fort William. The most prominent was his organization with Prime Minister Diefenbaker in early 1959. He organized a meeting with Diefenbaker about the closing of the Canadian Car Company, and the abandonment of its Fort William factory. Organized on behalf of Local 1075 of the United Auto Workers and Local 81 of the OEIU, Fisher, although not acting alone, succeeded in organizing the meeting with Diefenbaker to ensure that the factory stayed open in some capacity. I think when we're looking at Douglas Fisher retroactively, we need to have a nuanced position in his relationship to organized labor. He was, in my opinion, he recognized the benefits of union and was pro-union to a certain extent. He was just simply against the formal alliance of politics and unionism, arguing that the alliance with trade unionism would have a negative effect on the CCF and the NDP moving forward. The degree to which he was right, that's not for me to decide, but and it's probably not for you to decide either, but there is more information to be gleaned from that and as to whether or not Douglas Fisher's concerns about the emergence of the NDP and how the NDP has sort of operated and fared over the past 60 years. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I feel a little bit bad because I feel like I'm only painting half the picture of the NDP because I didn't talk about the trends impacting organized labor that occurred from 1940-ish or so to 1963. But with that in mind, there were parallel trends in the labor movement and the history of the CCF, in which by 1958, it was clear that to survive, the CCF needed labor and labor needed the political arm of the CCF. The labor movement achieved real gains in the post-war period, but lacked the capacity for direct action. The increase in union membership and the formal alliance also gave the CCF a formal and stable voting bloc. Meanwhile, the transition from the Robinson and Anderson era to the Fisher era reflects the changing nature of democratic socialism, both at Lakehead and and nationally and provincially, I should say. Next slide, please. So I just want to have a note on sources as well. I don't think anyone cares, which I shouldn't say, but I really, when I've tried to go about this presentation and my thesis more generally, I really tried to lean more on local sources. We have a great historical community here. I'm proud to be a part of it, although I don't do as much research and writing as I'd like to. Some of the great organizations that I was able to work with locally include the Lakehead University Archives, specifically the Douglas Fisher Funds and the Frederick Robinson Funds, which are a great insight into the CCF and democratic socialism during these 2 decades. There's so much more there that I could have used and looked into, but it was a great resource. The City of Thunder Bay Archives, the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society Archives, which I used not specifically, but mainly for my research into labor organizations. In particular, A.T. Hill, who was a noted his funds, and the Thunder Bay and District Labor Council funds. I was also able to use resources at the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Lakehead University Library, and the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society. I was able to access editions of the Fort William Daily Times Journal and Port Arthur News Chronicle. Anytime I talk about my research, I'd really like to plug the great historical resources and individuals we have operating them there, because I couldn't have done it without them. Next slide. Oh, that's the last slide. So I didn't really present an argument. It was more a chronicling of the history of the CCF into the NDP, but I think I was able to weave some threads in there. I hope that everyone enjoyed it. For anyone who is interested, my thesis is available online. If you just type my name in with LU or Lakehead Commons, where I go into more detail and you can sort of flesh out some of the arguments.
Just asking. Oh, we are back. Yeah. Okay. All right. So not in the Q&A, but Tori has asked: is there sufficient material in the Douglas Fisher Funds for a biography?
I think that there is. So Douglas Fisher is someone who isn't as mentioned in the secondary sources as he should be. I think that he's only really brought up in the context of his. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, we're good. So I think he's only really brought up in the context of his opposition to the emergence of the NDP. But there is a couple master's theses that have been done. One at Carleton, for example, that really has a lot of great sources. It's a good source itself, but it contains a lot of great sources on his career in journalism, something that I relied on heavily. I think that it would need to be flushed out a little bit, and you would need to find sources from other collections, including the Library and Archives of Canada and the Ontario Historical Society potentially. But to answer Tori's question, I think that there are great seeds for a biography on Douglas Fisher in those 19 boxes. I think that you can get a lot of core material that you would need to do some supplemental research to add to, but I think it would be a great start, and I think that there's enough to have the most makings of a biography.
No other questions yet? I'll go.
Sure.
You partly answered this, but I'm still having a hard time wrapping my mind around the tension between the organized labor versus the CCF. Was it an ideological thing? Were labor unions perceived as being too moderate or too conciliatory, or was it more of a pragmatic thing?
So most CCF members weren't opposed to formal alliances with trade unions and unionism. It was just Douglas Fisher and some other individuals who had reservations. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but unions throughout 1945-ish to like 1953, they underwent, I sort of talked about it briefly, but they underwent what we call a Red Scare, something like, Canadian McCarthyism, where a lot of prominent union members who had affiliations or were communists or affiliations with communists, they were purged from the union. So by the mid 1950s, most of the communists were already out of the unions. And I think that made it more digestible for an actual partnership between the CCF and the unions because they weren't radical anymore. They lost most of their radical leadership. So to answer your question, and this is based on the research that I did, not my own opinion, most CCFers were in favor of merging with trade unionism and with the CLC, or individuals like Douglas Fisher were hesitant because they didn't think that the public would receive it well. They thought that it would be an election or an electoral failure, and they thought that the unions wouldn't contribute on the day-to-day. They would just sort of bully the CCF and later the NDP into sort of putting a platform that they favored every election period, but wouldn't do the work in between elections. And you can see why Fisher sort of thought that even today, whenever unions are doing something that isn't, unions are attacked all the time with propaganda, right? Some of it's real and some of it's based in reality. Most of it is just fear mongering and hysteria. And when you're formally alliancing yourself with trade unionism, there's a lot of angles for political attack, which I think is what one of his main sources of anxiety was about. But he was the exception to the NDP creation, not the rule.
No other questions yet. To comments, Desiree D has shared a link to your thesis, and Sarah James, I think, in comment to Tori, mentioned the challenge would be the records LU has are fairly restricted in date range. You'd need other sources for other aspects of his career and life. That was in relation to how much Douglas Fisher bonds. Yeah, and Sarah, obviously, as archivist, would know so much more than I would, but that really just covers the genesis of his political career, because he was a very well-traveled individual. He fought in the war. He served as head of Hockey Canada. He was a longtime journalist with the Toronto Sun. There was a lot of different titles that he took on during his lifetime. I don't think he sleeps in on Saturdays till 11 like I do, to say the least. So busy man.
Our newspapers would cover a decent chunk of his life.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
One other question just came in. Do you think this history explains the tendency of the population to NDP and Liberal continues to this day in the Thunder Bay region, or is it the geography/industry of the region?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, it may have. So, do you think this history explains the tendency of the population to NDP and Liberal continues to this day in the Thunder Bay region, or is it the geography/industry of the region?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I don't have the electoral records on hand since 1963, but I'm fairly certain that the NDP and the Liberals have had an exclusive dominance over politics in this region, and I'm sure there are some exceptions. But just thinking back to what I do know, I know Jim Folds was an NDP member of Parliament. Ernest Epp. We've had there's currently NDP representatives representing Thunder Bay Superior North. Or not right now, but those candidates always do better, in my opinion, than the Conservatives. So I think it's a little bit of both. I do think that the history is important, but when you think about what industries drive this region, when you look at it from a perspective of class and sort of what the material conditions are and sort of what generates our economy, a lot of individuals, if not the majority, still do have ties to forestry and mining and other natural resource extraction or other natural resource protection. And those industries historically and contemporarily tend to lean left, if not far left, because of the, like I said, the historic and present accommodations and sort of role that left-wing groups play for those workers. So to answer your question, I think that, and I'm trying to phrase this answer without sounding like a Marxist, but more or less the material conditions of our geography influence what our politics are, and I think our industry and our region is really influenced by our natural environment, obviously. And I know that there are some attempts from our city and from our region to transition to a knowledge economy, but as great as those intentions are, we're still not there yet. And a lot of individuals do make their living in natural resources. And as long as that continues, we'll probably always strongly support, if not liberal, left-wing parties like the NDP.
No further questions yet.
Just a reminder to folks joining us online, please do use that Q&A function if you have any questions to ask. We'll just give another minute here if anyone wants to throw something else in there. A quick question from me. What was probably the most shocking thing that you learned during your research? What was something you uncovered that really, gave you a moment of pause to really think?
Something that I thought of that I think is really interesting is just sort of the media literacy and the political literacy around how politics and campaigns are run. So obviously things are way amplified and way polarized in today's society, but like just at its most basic level, the same attacks that, and I'm oversimplifying, but the same attacks that left-wing parties use on right-wing parties and right-wing parties use on left-wing parties, these are long established political traditions that I saw as far back as the 1940s. Even some of the language that individuals and parties use to sort of attack the other parties have historical roots and aren't just thought up in midair. But there's a legacy behind these, and we live in what people sometimes call a post-truth society or a fragmented truth society, where there's so many different media narratives and there's so many different sources of information. And all of this stuff that happened 70 years ago is taking place in certain areas of the internet, certain echo chambers, certain groups. So it's hard to recognize, but these aren't old tactics. These are things that are well established. And if you sort of study this history and you understand this history, you might gain a little bit of the literacy and media literacy skills to sort of read between the lines and understand what might be true, what might contain seeds of truth, and what might be propaganda. Just to tail on that, which is unrelated, another thing that I really found interesting was the handwritten letters from residents of the Port Arthur writing to Douglas Fisher in 1962 about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Obviously, with the threat of nuclear war, you're always living in a state of fear and anxiety. But during that 13-day crisis, there was the letters were incredible. Just the fear that were generated through the writing It's all handwritten, obviously. It was just really neat for me to see. It's something that I actually started researching in a different stream. And I thought that even though it was obviously between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Cuba, the Lakehead was thought of as a potential target because of our grain and our shipping. And just seeing those reactions and the actual genuine fear that families, parents, and individuals had in Port Arthur and Fort William, I thought was very, very neat.
One other follow-up question from Marianne. What was the difference in the radio ads that you mentioned? You said the approaches of politicians was so different in the 40s.
In the radio ads, so I think in the radio ads, they weren't as advertisement based, they were more policy based. I think when I made that comment, and I might have misspoken, but I think I meant mostly about the television ads by Douglas Fisher. So I don't know of any time where a politician has rented a block of space for himself, whether that even be 15 minutes, let alone half an hour, where they've actually sat down and went through the nuances of policy, despite the fact that the majority of Canadians would, probably appreciate that and understand that. They just don't communicate their ideas in such a way anymore where they actually want to flesh out the nuances of policy. Today, when you see ads on TV, they're 30 seconds. They're short. They're meant to be sound bites. They're meant to just grab our attention and leave. They're geared towards low attention spans, which is part of our media sort of helps us steer us into that direction. And a lot of times they're critical. A little bit of that has changed over the past 10 years with the emergence of podcasts, but still you rarely see politicians sit down and actually go over the intimate details of different policies and be able to speak knowledgeable on several issues at once. Even leaders' debates, they're 3 minutes. The most they get to speak is 3-minute sound bites. And when you're trying to lead a country, you can't go over foreign policy in 3 minutes without missing out on key factors or leaving yourself vulnerable to attack. So I think that's what more or less that I meant. And I only studied Thunder Bay, so I don't know if other politicians sort of talked about this, but that's just specifically Douglas Fisher who used those tactics, not necessarily politicians across Canada without confirmation. So I think that's what I was more or less intending to mean.
Okay. Well, let's have a round of applause for Nick. Thank you very much. And so with this lecture concluding, this brings to an end the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society's 2021 to 2022 lecture series, which normally runs from September through March of each season with a break on December. So we'll now be on break from our lecture series until September of this fall. And we will be making announcements on what our new lectures will be for the fall, probably later this summer. So do stay tuned for that. I would like to thank the sponsors of our lecture series, the Lakehead University Department of History, for their generous support, and of course to the staff and volunteers and the Programs and Plaques Committee who help plan and put together these lectures for the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society. So thank you everyone for attending. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Well done. Well done. I'm really relevant. And today, of course, the pact between the Liberals and
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Still.
Just kidding.
Oh.